We are slowly making our way through chapter 6, the Mitzvahs HaMonos HaLakus. We're on page 184 in the English translation. Last week's class I felt like nobody was really following, so we're going to do an extended review. The extended review is like this. The very beginning of our mimer was given over to discussion of the difference between knowledge and faith, and whether in fact faith and belief in God is a mitzvah. It was a very long discussion. Eventually we came to the conclusion that basically there are certain things about God which are given over to faith and which a person can connect to only with the power of the soul. That's called faith. They can connect to it only through sort of a super rational soul attachment to the idea, sort of like direct experience or participation in a certain reality. That's what it means. That's what faith is basically. It is the soul's ability to connect to something above the power of reason. And there are certain things about God which can be known through reason. That's how we started our whole discourse, if you remember. Then the discourse began to talk about the nature of God, which we've been doing for a very long time. And the reason why the discourse begins to talk about the nature of God is because we're moving toward a deeper understanding of what it is that's given over to faith and what it is that's given over to reason. Now, to start with, we basically separated between a faith-based approach to God and an understanding-based approach to God, and we were talking about them as if they were irreconcilable. We were saying that the Rambam has a way of understanding God in his Jewish philosophy and his Guide for the Perplexed, and the Maharal has a way of understanding God, and the Maharal's way is basically the way of faith. We didn't say this explicitly until after we had thoroughly explained both positions, but the Maharal's position is basically a God that is known through faith, and the Rambam's position is a God that is known through knowledge. And we said the two seem irreconcilable, right? Now, what was the whole explanation of why we can't reconcile? Why can't we put these two positions together, right? So the question arose out of out of trying to understand what God is. We said, if God acts, if God does anything, right? Our example throughout this discourse has been knowing, the act of knowing something outside of himself, or knowing anything at all. But it could really be anything. If God acts, if God does something, then he can't really be God. This is the logic. Why, if God acts, can he not be God? The reason God acts, a God who acts can't be God, is because God, by definition, has no parts. God is defined as the creator of the world, the being upon whom all else depends, and who himself or itself depends on nothing. That's the definition of God. God is the uncreated creator. Everything depends on him, and he depends on nothing. That's what we mean by God, even as a proposition. Even if we ask the question, what does it mean that God exists? What we're asking is there such a being that everything depends on him and he depends on nothing? Right? Now, a being upon whom everything depends and who depends on nothing, as it turns out, does exist and must exist. On the contrary, the world is only a possible being, whereas God is a necessary being. God must exist. By the fact that the world exists, God must exist, which we've discussed before. There's many ways of reaching that conclusion and of understanding that. Right, the simplest being that everything that's limited necessarily needs a creator, and therefore, and if their creator is limited, that creator needs a creator, and essentially this goes all the way back until you reach something that is unlimited, that does not require a creator. Right? There are many such arguments, many such things. This being, who is the foundation of everything that exists, is called God. Now, if God acts, what's the problem with God acting? The problem with God acting is that if God acts, he has parts, right? If a person does something, they do it not with their entire being, but they do it with a certain faculty, right? If God thinks, then he thinks with his mind, so to speak. If he loves with his heart, or his capacity for emotion, right? If God moves, then he has a capacity for locomotion, right? To move in space, right? For example. If God does any of these things, that means he has a faculty. You would have God, you would have his knowledge, the thing that he uses to know, his mind, and you would have the thing that is known, the object of his knowledge, right? The problem is that if you have God and his knowledge, right, then basically you have something which is like a body, which number one is Judaically a big no-no, but beyond being Judaically a big no-no, it's also a philosophical problem. It's a philosophical problem for God to have parts. If God has parts, that means that essentially you have two things which exist in a system, you have two things which exist in a relationship, you have God and his knowledge. Anything that exists in a relationship is defined in part by that relationship, which means that God is not the uncreated creator of everything. Right? That means that God is defined in a sense by his knowledge. This is the technical explanation, right? God is a being who knows, and in order to know, he needs his knowledge. He's therefore defined by his knowledge, right? His knowledge adds something to his existence. His knowledge is part of what he is, and therefore, why are you calling this thing God? You should call the thing that unites these two parts God. Right? You should call, there's God and his knowledge, you should call the system altogether, you should call that God, right? But then you have a system, right? And the system itself needs parts. You can't have the system without its parts, so then the system is dependent on the parts. And you essentially do not have one creator. You have the same question of a limited thing, right? A defined thing needing a creator. That question continues back, right? It means that it has parts is that we haven't hit on God yet. We have to keep going further back. God himself cannot have parts, right? If God cannot have parts, then it seems that he cannot act. How can he know without having parts? He would know with his mind, it would seem. There's two answers to this question. There's the Rambam's answer and the Maharal's answer. The Rambam's answer to this question is that God doesn't do anything. God does not act. There is no act of knowledge on God's behalf. Rather, God is defined in negative terms. What's the fancy term is apophatic theology. He's known through negative theology. We say that we don't know what God is, but we do know that he has none of the limitations of anything in our world, almost by definition, right? Again, there's explanations. I'm skipping a lot of things, but the point is that almost by definition, the creator of everything, who needs nothing to exist, has no limitations. If he has no limitations, says the Rambam, why do we assume that he knows the way that we know? When we know, we have us, our knowledge, and the object of the knowledge. The Rambam says, by God, that's just an assumption. Why should we assume that's true by God? God doesn't know like we know. His knowledge is not our knowledge, right? God knows in a way that the knower, the knowledge, and the known are all one. That's the Rambam's conclusion. If you remove all limitations to knowledge, because you can't say God doesn't know, you can't say there's anything lacking in God's knowledge, which means that you say that God knows everything that we know, but he doesn't need to know it in a limited way, what you're left with is basically one God who, by being God, knows everything. There's no act of knowledge. There's simply him being God. By being God, what is God? He accomplishes, he has all the virtues of the knower, the knowledge, and the known unified as one. There's only one God. God is one. And he knows, he has all aspects of knowledge exist simply by him being God, because he has no limitations. He doesn't have the limitation of being separate from his knowledge, which in turn is separate from the object of his knowledge. God has none of those limitations. In God's mind, so to speak, he doesn't really have a mind. In God, all these things are one. He knows simply by virtue of being himself. The Maharal, pardon?
That's sort of interesting.
It is interesting.
From that point of view, then, if he doesn't do anything or whatever, he just knows everything, he must also get bored. As well.
He doesn't have being bored is a limitation. He doesn't have a limitation of being bored.
But
being bored implies a lack of stimulation, right? The reason why a person gets bored is because a person has a limit.
So
there's no doing.
No. Think about it.
Well,
Think about it. If a person's bored, A person has a capacity to do things that's not being used. And this causes a sense of irritation, which is called boredom. He has a capacity to know something or to be involved in something, right? God has no capacities that are not being used. God is...
Why?
Why not? Because God is the perfection of everything. He has no lacks.
Why can't he keep expanding?
Pardon?
Why can't
He does.
What do you mean by keep expanding? He's not physical.
Expanding his abilities, whatever it is.
Because
He does.
he's perfection. The idea of expanding is for someone who has a limited. He has a limited being. He has ignorance of something, and he learns something new. God has no ignorance of anything. The Rambam
It's
will
not a
tell
matter
you.
of ignorance. It's just creating new stuff.
What, creating new things? I don't know. The idea that God creates new things is an interesting question. It's a separate issue.
That's why I'm wondering where this
Separate
goes.
question. That God creates new things.
That's
It's
what
interesting.
I'm thinking.
I don't know. The Maharal's solution to the problem of whether of God's action, that God cannot do actions, like a person does actions. Remember, the Rambam's solution is essentially that God does not act. God is just God, and by being God, he knows everything. The Maharal's solution is that God has a mind. The mind is completely separate from him. God has a mind. The mind is completely separate from him. In other words, the Maharal says, if you can accept that there is a limited creation and an infinite God, you should be able to accept that there's a limited mind of God as well, which is separate from God, right? The Maharal points out that this mind is as far away from him as physical creation, right? The example we used in class was that his mind, his thought, his thinking about the cup is as far away from him as the actual physical cup itself. His thoughts are a creation, basically, is the basic understanding of the Maharal. Tzemach Tzedek goes on and says the Maharal is really saying something else, but our basic understanding of the Maharal's position is that God has a mind that is completely separate from him. It's like a creation. God's mind is like a creation, which is a very strange thought. Because what does that even mean? We have no conception of what it means to have a mind that's a creation. Maybe a mind, they talk nowadays about how a person's mind is extended to the physical tools they use, right? Like people talk about how people need to remember less because they can Google. So in a sense, Google is an extension of the mind to some extent, right? Or any tools you use, like a calculator or an abacus, or it could be anything, right? In some sense, it's a physical manifestation or extension of the mind, right? Which is interesting. But the Maharal wouldn't say that about God, because the Maharal is saying that there isn't really a mind. There's no mind there to begin with. There's only the abacus. There's only a separate creation. There's only a separate physical thing. Not physical, pardon me, but a separate thing outside of God, which is like to him like a physical creation, the same distance from him. Each of these solutions, the Rambam solution and the Maharal solution, one says that God does not have a mind, and the other one says that God's mind is created separate from him. Each has its advantages and disadvantages. In the Rambam's answer, God is at the level of his thoughts. God's knowledge of the world is part of what God is, in the Rambam solution. Part of what it means to be God is to know the world, and know the world in all its detail, and know everything that takes place within the limited creation. In the Maharal's answer, God is above the level of thought. Thought is an external creation. Thought is of the world, whereas God is something which totally transcends the world. The advantage of the Rambam's position is that God does know what takes place within the world, right? It's clear that there's God's knowledge, and you can't say that God doesn't care about his knowledge. On the contrary, there is no separate knowledge. There is just God. So how can you say that it's so to speak, of no concern, right? Or the knowledge doesn't reach God, or word doesn't reach God of what takes place within the world. On the contrary, there is no knowledge and there is no word. God's knowledge is himself. He himself is his knowledge. There's no separation between him and his knowledge, right? In which case there's a certain closeness between God and the creation. The disadvantage, which is why the Maharal doesn't like the Rambam's answer, is because what this seems to say is that God is at the same level of knowledge, which really lowers down God. It says that God, by definition, has something to do with the creation. The creation, in some sense, binds God. God is a being of intellect, right? God himself, as part of the definition of being God, has something to do with the world, which to the Maharal seems like a incredible, so to speak, desecration, a lowering down, making God mundane.
Giduf.
Yeah, an insult. God by definition is related to the world. The Maharal says God by definition is transcendent, unknowable, one, infinite. The disadvantage of the Maharal's approach is that it's not clear what relationship God has with his knowledge of the world. If his knowledge of the world is a creation, just like the cup is a creation, then what relationship does he... That's why the Rambam found this answer untenable, because it makes no sense. What relationship does he have with his knowledge? His knowledge is not really his knowledge. His knowledge is just another thing that he's created. Right? It seems that God is totally removed from the world. God is aloof. What knowledge does he really have of the world? His knowledge is a creation. What we call his knowledge is just a creation. So essentially to the Rambam, the Tzemach Tzedek asks, where is the God who is one, who totally transcends the world? And to the Maharal he asks, where is God's relationship with the world? And isn't his knowledge basically... Maybe we should worship his knowledge. His knowledge is some sort of second God, or some sort of... His knowledge is the thing that knows about us. God himself is removed from us. So to the Maharal, we essentially ask, where is the God over the world? In other words, the God who's involved in the world. And to the Rambam, we ask, where is the God who transcends the world? Right? And the Tzemach Tzedek explains it is this very question that is answered by the prophetic revelation to the Arizal and the Ramak of the Kabbalah, of the idea of Ur and Kli, the idea of light and vessel. The answer to the questions to each, the Rambam and the Maharal, are answered by the light and the vessel. The Rambam would tell you, where is the God who transcends the world? He is the light. In other words, so to speak, we're putting words in the Rambam's mouth, so to speak. Where is the God who transcends the world? The God who transcends the world is the light. The Rambam would tell you, when I'm speaking only of, the Tzemach Tzedek says, the Rambam would tell you, right? The Rambam would tell you that when I'm talking about God, simply by being God, he knows the world. By definition, I'm not talking about God himself, of course. I'm talking about in the spheres. I'm talking about in God's knowledge, in the Kabbalah. I'm talking about the vessels for the light. In the vessels, God knows the world by definition. That's when I'm speaking of the God who knows the world by definition. When I'm speaking of when I put this limitation on God, that he is the knower, the knowledge, and the known all at once, when I define God by his knowledge, by his perfect knowledge of the world, I am describing the vessels of the Kelim of Atzilus. That's what I'm describing. I'm describing that more limited and defined manifestation of godliness. When you ask the Maharal, well, where is God who knows the world, right? Because the Maharal said God was totally transcendent and one and above the world, and his knowledge was just a creation. The Rambam would say, oh, no. His knowledge that's a creation is the vessels, but God himself is the light who is invested within the vessels. When I say God is totally aloof, I don't mean that I mean that God himself, true, is totally aloof, but God's light extends to within the vessels. It is God who gives the vessels life. God provides, God expresses himself through these vessels, and therefore God is found within the vessels as well. By connecting yourself to the vessels, you connect yourself to God as well. Therefore, we have both. We have something which is God's knowledge, which is not God, which is separate from God, and yet is not really separate from him. We have something that is separate from him. It's not God, but it's also not a creation. We have a third type of thing. The third type of thing is godliness, is elokus, an expression of God that is not God himself. And within the elokus, within godliness, which the only godliness we've really been describing is the 10 spheres, the 10 means by which God creates the world, the 10 godly expressions that God uses to create the world. Within the spheres, you have the light and the vessels. You have the transcendent presence of God. God is represented in the spheres by his light. and you have the worldly, you have the means by which God relates to a limited world, which is the vessels. The vessels give the light definition. There's one light and 10 vessels, at least as we've been describing it. And the vessels give God definition. The vessels are the part that make it knowledge. The light are the part that make it God. And together you have God's knowledge. This is Chassidus' conclusion based on Lurianic Kabbalah, based on the Kabbalah of the Arizal. So together these things are God's knowledge. Now, the question then becomes, well, what are the nature of these things? Why are we able to do this trick, right? Clearly, we're reading the Maharal and the Rambam in a very advantageous way to say that what they're saying is really different parts of what the Arizal is saying. In other words, we're saying that what they are saying is true for different aspects of the Arizal's whole picture, right? It's like the famous parable of the different blind men who grabbed the elephant, right? And one says that the elephant is a rope, right? And one says, no, the elephant's like a big wall, right? One says, no, the elephant's like a tree, right? Every one of them has a different part of the elephant. None of them sees the whole, right? This is the example, so to speak. So the Rambam and the Maharal each are speaking to, and it's not necessarily that they don't know. They are simply intent to only speak about a certain aspect of this spiritual reality, whereas the Arizal, so to speak, gives us the whole picture and shows why they're not in contradiction. Why the Maharal is talking about the light and the Rambam is talking about the vessels, more or less. So we're reading this in a very advantageous way, such that each of them is discussing part of the truth. But the reality is that, of course, at least in the simple level, without going into godly inspiration or anything like that, the Rambam was not, it seems, talking about the vessels of Atzilus. The Rambam seemed to have thought that he was talking about God himself, not talking about the vessels of the spheres. And the reason why is because this whole construction that we have, this whole idea that we have something which is not a creation, which is not God, would to the Rambam have been a totally foreign idea. There's no indication in philosophy. You can't see from the world that there is such a thing as godliness, right? You can't see that there is such a thing which is one with God, and yet not God himself. And therefore, the Rambam's description, at least in this aspect of the knower, the knowledge, and the known all at once, is a description of God as a being of infinite intelligence, or something like that, infinite in a higher sense than the normal sense we use it in. This description of God really only reaches to the vessels of Atzilus, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya. This description of God is fitting only for the vessels, but not for God himself. But the reason why the Rambam could only speak to the vessels is because this idea of something which is united with God, yet there is an infinite God who is united with something that is finite, yet the finite thing is actually infinite and does not contradict God's infinitude. This whole thing sounds like a paradox. What is this thing? How can there be something which is limited and yet totally united with him, right? And that is basically what set us out on this, the part of the Maimer that we're on now, which we've been doing for a couple of chapters already, right? We have to understand, it's vital to understand what is the light and what is the vessels, so we can understand how it's possible that there can be an infinite God who has a light which perfectly expresses him, and that light unites with something which seems to be defined and finite, and yet that defined and finite thing is so one with God that it's, number one, not considered a creation. Number two, we even say that it's God's knowledge. This itself is God's knowledge, right? Or even if you want to speak more coarsely, which of course it's never meant to be taken literally, but if you want to speak more coarsely, you could even speak of what we say in Pasach Eliyahu, like on Erev Shabbos, about God's body, right, which is the spheres. You have, so to speak, quote unquote, you have God's right arm and God's left arm, or Chesed and Gvura, and all of these things, right? God forbids to say that God has a body, right? It's against halacha to believe that God has a body, right, or even the form of a body, any sort of limitation, just like the Rambam said at the beginning. Yet somehow we have these things called the spheres, which are the reason why it's called a body, as we've explained in previous classes, is because it's nullified to him like your body is to you, right? If I lift up the cup, we don't say Tzvi's hand lifted up the cup, we say Tzvi lifted up the cup. right? That's the nature of Atzilus. The nature of this godly expression is such that it's totally united with Him. It's as if God Himself is acting. And the question is, how is that possible? We are going to try and understand, to the best of our ability, what is the light and what is the vessels, such that you can have this paradox. You have something which is infinite and something which appears to be finite, and they can unite. That's the discussion that we're in the middle of in our Maimer. Now, what are we talking about these past few weeks? We're talking about the vessels. The vessels, we've been talking about the light also, but the main focus is on the vessels. And basically, we've been explaining what it means that the vessels are not a creation. That's what we've been explaining for a few weeks now. The vessels are not a creation. The vessels are basically a very attenuated, a very weak form of the original light, as we've been explaining. There was God's infinite light. The light was removed. What was left over was also an expression of God, but something so incommensurately lower, so limited that it's only called the reshimu, the remnant, the leftover, the impression that the light originally made, and that it's so low that we say that compared to the infinitude of the original light, it's even considered as if it's finite, even though it itself is infinite. And this is the source for the kalim. This is the source for the vessels. Last week we explained that the vessels, we explained the interesting middle position that the vessels occupy, right? They're not God's kindness in Atzilus, the vessel of kindness, right? The vessel which makes God's light into chesed, into kindness, is on the one hand, is limited and is defined as kindness. It is a defined creation, which means that to Him it's created, we said last week, not in a way of, is the air conditioning on? We said in a way it's created not in a way of iland olol, not in a way of cause and effect, but it's so low that it's created almost as if something from nothing, almost with a total break from God. It's simply a new creation almost. So it's very low, it's very distant from God. On the other hand, we explained last week, it's not like the Malach Michael, it's not like the angel Michael. The angel Michael, the Malach Michael, is God's kindness, but God's kindness as it's expressed in a creation. It's not God's kindness itself. It's a being that has the tendency, that is created from God's kindness. But it's not God's kindness itself, right? The angels are a separate creation. They're spiritual. They are bottled to God. They are nullified to God. They have no real separate existence, but nevertheless, they are a separate creation.
When they express kindness, when He expresses kindness, is it His kindness?
Yes.
Or is it God's kindness?
No, it's His kindness. It's His kindness. He's a separate creation. Malach Michael is a separate creation.
As a messenger to God's kindness.
Yeah, but he's just a messenger. A messenger is a messenger. Spheres are not a messenger. In fact, if you remember, we actually had a Kabbalist that was brought in the Ramak that said that the Sphira was a messenger, and the Tzemach Tzedek freaked out. You remember? Freaked out's very not a respectful way of referring to it. But the Tzemach Tzedek was not impressed, right? And he said the Ramak himself was not impressed by this Kabbalist who said that the Spheres are like messengers. The messenger is a separate being. That's the path to Avodah Zarah. It's the path to idol worship. The Spheres are not separate beings. The Malach Michael is a separate being. He's actually a creation. He's a creation not unlike us. God's kindness, which when we say God's kindness, what do we mean? We mean at the moment the vessel of the Sphira of kindness, one of God's 10 spheres. That vessel is an expression of God Himself. It is not a separate creation. Right? That is why, I can't remember if we said it last week or if we still have to say it this week, but that is why the world of Atzilus is called Atzilus and not Bria. The second of the spiritual worlds, below the spheres that we're talking about, is called Bria, which means creation. Why is that where creation is? Why is creation in the second world? Because the first world is not a creation. The first world is an expression of God. Right? There's other things you could say, right? Well, let's leave it at there for now. So that's basically what we've been discussing.
Once you start creation, then you start a chain effect of creations.
Correct. In fact, we said last week that even between the Sphirot themselves, even between the Spheres and the vessels themselves, there is a certain cause and effect relationship. But the Spheres, as they're initially created from God, the vessels, as they're initially created from God, are created anew, almost like something from nothing.
some hot water in here.
Sure, thanks. Okay, let's start on page 185. 185, 3 lines from the bottom. We have 20 minutes left. We can move forward in this discourse. 185, 3 lines up from the bottom. Afal Piken. Yeah, nevertheless, it says in English. You see where I am? 185, 3 lines up from the bottom. Afal Piken. Nevertheless. Chapter 6.
We're repeating something from last
Just
week?
a little bit, probably.
Okay.
Probably like one line or something.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, Chochmah, God's intelligence, God's knowledge, is not at all comparable. It's totally incommensurate to God's simple light, to God's infinite light, the expression of everything that God is. It is created through an incredibly powerful contraction, through a tzimtzum. God removed his light, and that's what created the spheres, as we've been discussing. And it is the fact that it is created through this powerful tzimtzum means that it's a transition memahus lamahus. Last line on 185. It's a transition from one type of thing to another, right? He's saying, what the Tzemach Tzedek is saying is that the vessels are essentially different from the original godly light. It's not just that they're quantitatively different. It's not like there is simply a diminishing of the light. Because there are, if you learn Chassidus, you'll learn that there's tzimtzumim later, which are like just a diminishing of the light, a decrease of the, so to speak, quantitatively, a decrease in the amount of light, right? Like there's famous passages, I think, from the Zohar talking about there's a window, and then there's a crack in the wall, right? There's a hole, and there's a window, and then there's the bigger hole, smaller holes, right? As metaphors for the limitation of the light. This is not like that. This is a total break, and then something new, basically. It's a whole new type of thing, the vessels. That's how we're emphasizing again how limited they are. However, we nevertheless call these vessels godliness. They are not a separate creation, a separate and independent creation, like the kindness of Michael, of the angel Michael. Because Michael, the angel Michael, is a separate spiritual existence, an independent spiritual existence. Who really desires God, right? As we said last week, he desires God to the extent that he desires to not exist, which is what the highest angels desire. It's also what the soul desires, if you learn Tanya. The godly soul desires to not exist, basically, to be totally united with God, have no independent existence whatsoever. And the reason why he was created as a separate existence, and so too all the other creations, is in order that their light and life should be concealed, in order that their godly source should be concealed. Generally speaking, when we say light and life, we mean that there's two different godly sources for everything. Everything is created through a combination of Seviv and Mamale, a combination of God's two holy names, Havaya and Elokim, God's infinitude and God's finitude, right? The light that creates a thing is God's infinitude, and the Chayos, the life, is God's finitude, right? This is just a footnote for those who understand. If you don't understand, don't worry about it. We say the light and the light. When we say the V'chayos, the light and the life, we're referring to two different sources in godliness, two different types of godliness that create everything. And the reason why why even have why even have a limited angel or a limited creation? Why is everything below the spheres, everything below the vessels, created in a limited way, that it's an independent creation, is in order that the light and life force should be concealed within them, by the power of God's severity, from his gvura. There's the Shem Elokim I was describing before. God's ability to conceal himself, basically. In order that the creation should appear on its own as a separate and independent existence. Even though in truth it exists before him as nothing. If you'll recall, this is our class from 2 weeks ago and 3 weeks ago, that the contraction and the tzimtzum does not change the light. It doesn't change God. It doesn't change God, and it doesn't even change his light. The only thing that the tzimtzum actually affects, the only thing that the contraction of the light actually changes, is the perspective of the nivra. Right? It changes our ability to see the godliness of everything. Right? So why does God create us as a separate existence? In order that the light should be concealed, in order that we should appear to ourselves as separate from God. In other words, the truth is that nothing is separate from God. The truth is that kula kamei kulei chashiv, right? Everything is totally nullified before God. God is the only true reality. Nevertheless, what does it mean when we say something is an independent existence? Why does he create? What do we mean when we say he creates these levels lower than the vessels of Atzilus? We mean that he is creating a perspective for the creation. When we say he creates an independent existence, we mean he creates a being who perceives of itself as independent, basically, is what we're saying. He has the experience of independence. As opposed to the vessels, Chachma, the highest of the vessels of Atzilus, which we said last week stands in for all of them. All of the vessels of Atzilus are not independent creations at all, God forbid. Rather, they are actually godliness. They are actually expressions of God. They are not independent creations. The Chachma of Atzilus is God's Chachma. The wisdom, the knowledge of Atzilus is God's wisdom. We do not refer, it has no independent existence. When we refer to it, this is God's wisdom we refer to. So to the other spheres, so to God's bina, God's understanding, das and his knowledge and his chesed, his kindness. He contracts his light so that it shines in a concentrated manner until there can be a limited expression such as wisdom or kindness, which shine from him in a revealed manner. In other words,
Makes more sense than last one.
In other words, what's special about Atzilus as opposed to things lower than Atzilus is not necessarily that it's let's think of this, how to say this carefully. Atzilus is godliness. Bria is a separate creation, even though it's spiritual and very lofty. The spheres that we're describing are godliness. Lower than the spheres is a separate creation. What's the difference between being godliness and being a creation? The creation is also an expression of God, right? Where else would it come from if it were not an expression of God, right? In other words, what do you think it's made of? It's not made of something else, right? God, the whole universe is God's expression, right? We say in the beginning God created, God said, let there be light, right? The words became the light. The entire creation is the godly expression. So what's the difference between the thing that we call godliness and the thing that we call the separate creation? The difference is in the perception they themselves are allowed to have. The difference is in their own being, right? Chachma in itself, so to speak. If Chachma of Atzilus could perceive itself, if God's wisdom perceived itself, it would perceive itself as part of God, right? Just like when your mind thinks about itself, it doesn't think of itself separate from you, unless you're very sick, right? When your mind thinks about itself, it doesn't think about itself as separate from you. It thinks about it as I'm my mind, right? You're saying, my mind. Your mind is part of you, right? As opposed to Bria, as opposed to creation, even the highest angels do not say, in themselves, they don't say, I am God's kindness. They say, I am a servant of God who has no separate existence from God and desires to, and what separate existence I do have, I desire to destroy or to have removed, to be taken away from me. Maybe that's something an angel would say, right? But the God's knowledge is actually God's knowledge, right? It's actually united with Him. Even though, when you look at it in the perspective of everything we spoke about before, God Himself and the light and everything else, they're limited. You have both together, right? There's no quick way of explaining this. It's like a paradox. You have to work at both sides, right? You have to explain it always how it's not God Himself, always how it's limited, and you also have to explain how, on the contrary, this is God's wisdom. Right? The very fact that it's wisdom means it can't be God itself. The very fact that it's wisdom means it's infinitely removed from God, because it's a defined existence. It's wisdom and not kindness. This means it's not one with God. Right? Why are there 10 different things all of a sudden? This is an unbelievable demonstration that it's infinitely removed from God. The difference between 1 and 2 in spiritual terms is not 1. The difference between 1 and 2 is infinity, right? In spiritual terms, right? The oneness of God is not an arbitrary one within a set. It is the one, right? It is being itself. It's the ground for everything else. We've discussed this concept before, right? God, when we say God is one, and God is united, and God is infinite, we mean then there's no room for a second. Not that there's one and then there's more. We mean one, He's Yachid, He's not just Echad, He's alone. There's only one. There's no room for anything else to exist. The very fact that there should be, this one is knowledge and this one is kindness, means we're not talking about God Himself. God forbid to say so. We're talking at a very removed level from God. On the other hand, this removed level from God is so united with God that we call it God's wisdom, God's kindness. Yeah? One second. כדי להשפיע על ידי כיחס אלו לקוסר באלמס, כדי שיהיו על איפן שהם עתה, שזה אי אפשר זולסי על ידי הרסה על ידי עשר ספירס אלו דווקא. Why does He have these spheres then, right? You have God in the creation. What's the role of this intermediate level? Because He uses these spheres, He uses this godliness, this third level, which is neither Him nor the creation, to convey godliness into the world, in order that they should exist as they are now, which is impossible except through using the spheres. Okay, so in order that the world should be as they are now, there has to be, he's not really explaining why. In order that the world should be as they are now, our world, all the spiritual worlds, including our physical world, in order that the creation should be as it is, it has to be created through the process of spheres, right? It has to be created through the process of godliness. We explained before, you can go, right, there's both sides. We've explained more at length the one side, which is why the world can't be created from God's infinite light directly, without any tzimtzum, right? And the answer is because the world would itself be, just as your mind says about itself, I am part of the person that I'm part of, everything would say that with regards to God, if there were no tzimtzum. If there were no tzimtzum, everything that would merely be part of God's subjective reality, merely a pure expression of God. Right? So that's why you can't there has to be a tzimtzum. The light has to be removed for there to be room in order for there to be an objective reality, in order for something to be able to say, I, and not be referring to God, there has to be a tzimtzum. On the other hand, why don't we create everything directly through the tzimtzum? In other words, why doesn't God take away all the light and leave a world and so to speak, why doesn't He create a world directly out of the tzimtzum? What's with the spheres? Why is there this intermediary level where God emanates this reality that's totally united with Him, and then He uses that to create the world, or the world is created from that? Why not just create the world and be separate, right? The answer, pardon?
Then it wouldn't be limited.
No, then it would be limited. Right. On the contrary, the difference is, the reason why is because the entire purpose of the creation is that the limited reality should be revealed to be one with godliness. The entire purpose of the creation is that the limited reality should be shown to be one with godliness. In other words, you have to have both. In order for the world to be a world, there has to be a tzimtzum. But in order for the world to fulfill its purpose, in order for the world to do what it has to do, there has to be godliness within the world also. Therefore, the world is created through a mixture of both. It's created through kelim and ur, through tzimtzum and light, through contraction and revelation, right? That's why the world is created as a duality, and that's why there's both. That's why you have revelation and concealment. God is both revealed and concealed within the world, which is a function of the world being created through the spheres, which are made of both light and vessel, which originate from the ray and the remnant, right? The kav and the reshimu, right? It's the same thing at multiple levels. God creates the world with this duality because the world has to have both. If the world was only light, it would be totally united with Him, and it would not be a world. World in Hebrew is Milosh and Helam, which I'm surprised we haven't said in the Maamar yet.
You get that separation.
That's why there has to be the sphere is not a separation. The sphere is not only a separation. The sphere is only half. The sphere is only half a separation. The sphere is only half a separation. The sphere is half united.
The separation.
No, the sphere does not create the separation.
The boundary.
No. The separation is created by the tzimtzum. The sphera is at the boundary. That doesn't mean it creates the boundary. The sphera does not create the separation. The tzimtzum creates the separation. The removal of the light. The removal of the light to leave something else open. To leave over vessels. That vessels are left over. That's what creates. So that's what creates the limitation.
There's a test.
The light is what creates unity. And which one does the world need? The answer is the world needs both. The world needs both. The world needs to be a world that has to be separate, but to be a world, it also has to be united with God. A world by definition is separate, but if God is creating it for the purpose that God creates our world, in other words, in order for a world to be a world, it also has to be united with God. In order for a world to be a world, it has to be both.
Yeah,
for a world
a
world by definition has to be both limited and united with God, and therefore you have both of these things. Therefore, here's where it says in the Maamar what I said before. 4 lines down on 186. Therefore, the 10 spheres are called Atzilus and not Bria. The 10 spheres are referred to by the name of emanation rather than creation. Atzilus, the term Atzilus, emanation, comes from the language v'yatzal min haruach, that God emanated from the Spirit. This is describing what happened in the desert. That it says God transferred Moses' divine inspiration to 70 elders. It describes in the book of Bamidbar. And the language it uses there, v'yatzal min haruach, God emanated, or God radiated forth, he translates here, from the Holy Spirit of Moshe onto the 70 elders. Right? That's where this language comes from. Emanated or radiated is the same word as Atzilus. He separated out a ray from Moshe's spirit to the 70 elders, but only as a ray, right? Only as a single
ray.
Expression, right? Moshe himself remained Moshe. There was no one like Moshe, but everyone else got like a taste, a little expression. Shekach ha'atzilus hema mebechinas ziv v'ara insof. Similarly, atzilus is a ray and a light from God's infinite light. From God's Ein Sof, you have Atzilus, which is like a little ray. Just like the elders got a ray of Moshe's full powers, so too the world of Atzilus gets a ray of God's infinite light. That's where the language comes from. That's why Atzilus is called Atzilus. Not as a separate entity, right? The emphasis here is that it's the same power. You took Moshe's power and you just gave a little bit to the Zakanim. Atzilus is the same light, the same God's infinite light, just a little bit, in a smaller expression. In other words, the emphasis is, it's not a separate creation. It's not like God gave the 70 elders a new, smaller Ruach HaKodesh. He gave them a little bit from Moshe. So to Atzilus is the same thing. It's not new. It's not a new creation. It's one with God. It's a little expression. It's a ray. It's a ray of the original light, of the original infinite light. Since this ray shines within them in a revealed way, because the infinite light of God, as we explained before, shines in Atzilus in a revealed way, not in such a limited way like it does within the creation, as we've just been explaining. Right? Atzilus is actually part of God. The light there is revealed. Right? It is revealed how they are not separate from God in Atzilus. The God's wisdom in Atzilus is actually God's wisdom, as opposed to the creation where their unity with God is concealed. The unity of the creation with God is not revealed. They're not aware. The creation is not aware of it. The angel Michael is not aware that he is one with God. He perceives of himself as a separate entity, although very desirous of God and very holy. In other words, very nullified to God's will, etc. As we know that Michael is so the light is so contracted within him that he sees himself as a separate creation, and that's why it's called Bria. The implication of the word create, the Hebrew word creation, Bria, is creation as a separate thing. In Chassidus and Kabbalah. Creation, Bria, right? Bereshis bara. Creation means creation as something that's independent, or at least perceives, it seems to be independent, right? The emphasis of creation is independence. As opposed to in the 10 spheres. Therefore, Nikra Atzilus gam milashon etzel v'samuch. Atzilus has another implication, which is etzel v'samuch. Etzel means by. Like in Hebrew you would say, are you going to be who are you going to eat your Shabbos meal by? Etzlo, like by him. I'm going to eat it with him together.
Etzel is outside.
No, Etzel is by.
What's outside in Hebrew?
Chutz.
Outside?
Yeah.
Chutz.
Isn't there Etzel or something?
No.
Don't know. Etzel is by, and Samuch means adjacent, close. So you have Etzel and Samuch. You have close to him, near God, by God. That's the implication of the word Atzilus also, that it's close to him. Nevertheless, compared to God's very essence, God himself, this is contracted like only a ray. The distance, in truth, the distance between these vessels of Atzilus, these spheres, the difference between the spheres and God's infinite light is further than the distance between us and the spheres. The distance from us to the spheres is less than the distance between the spheres and God's infinite light. Right? To emphasize this shows you how distant they are. Right? If you actually understand how far we are from the spheres and how low we are compared to the spheres, in other words, us compared to God's actual wisdom. Right? Us compared to God's actual knowledge of us, right, in the world of Atzilus, right, is closer than God's actual knowledge of us is to God himself. Right? So something to think about, something that's hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, we're in the juice of the garbage can.
God forbid.
But that's what it is.
Yeah, but that's what God likes. We have an advantage. The sphera is so far from God that to him, the sphera, God's knowledge of us and us, are equal before him as the same thing. Right? So in other words, we're bringing back the idea of the Maharal. What the Maharal said was ultimately true. The spheres, referring here again, we're talking about the kelim, the vessels. This whole chapter is about the vessels. Right? The spheres are as distant they're basically as distant from God as we are, right? And before him, it's basically equal. There's the spheres and us, and to him, the distance is so close as to be irrelevant. Kanal Perek Dalet, as we said before in chapter 4, al pasuk kulam b'chochma asisa, on the verse that all of them you have made with chachma, all of them you have made with wisdom. Shespheres chachma, because the sphere of chachma, which remember is the highest of the spheres, im hademim da'asiyah shavim mamash kamei yizbarech, is literally like the inanimate objects of Atzilus before God. Before God, his own wisdom.
Da'asiyah, not Atzilut.
Sorry, da'asiyah. His own wisdom, which is it is his wisdom, but nevertheless, because it's defined and because it's limited, it is as distant from God himself as an actual physical rock in our world. That is the distance between God and his knowledge. And even in relation to his simple light, even in regard to Or Ein Sof, which is not him himself, right, but his infinite light, the original light, which is still not God himself, even in comparison to that light, Imshu Ziv Bilvad, one second. Oh, sorry, I misread that. Pardon me. Imshu Ziv Bilvad, even though it's only a ray, even though the spheres of Atzilus are only a ray of light, and the light, nevertheless, is still representative of the source. And the spheres are called God, actual God, and Hashem Rachmasu Binaseh. Second. Maybe I didn't misread this as badly as I thought. Okay, last try. Pardon me, I'm tired. The spheres erase everything. The spheres, not everything. Erase the last 45 seconds. The spheres are incommensurate to God himself. They're as far away from God as a physical rock is. They're also as far away from his original infinite light, from Or Ein Sof. Before the Tzimtzum, they're as far away from even that light as they are from us. Even though the Or Ein Sof is only a light, nevertheless, the light is representative of everything that God is. So the distance between even the infinite light and the spheres is infinite. It's so far away that the spheres are like a physical rock.
What came first, the spirit or the void?
The spheres are, if you remember our discussion of the light and the void and the Tzimtzum, the spheres are only an eventuality, or an eventual reality. There's many things that come before the spheres. Yeah, they're after the Tzimtzum. They're created by the Tzimtzum. The contrary, as we said before, it's the remnant. It's what's left over from the Tzimtzum that is the source of the vessels.
Well, we used to say that it was a remnant of the light that was left over.
Correct. Remnant of the light.
So that light became the
that what was left over became the vessels. Yes, the source of the vessels. Nevertheless, these limited spheres, which are to him like rocks, are called literal God, which is his wisdom and knowledge. Okay, we'll pause here. So we see that we're walking this balancing act constantly. We're constantly walking this balancing act between the spheres being infinite and God's own wisdom and the means by which God creates the world and a necessary part of the creation of the world, and nevertheless being basically as distant from God as an inanimate physical object. And we have both of these are true together. It's very hard to understand how both are true, but both are true together. And that's what we're concluding at the end of today's class.